If you've ever wondered why it's so hard to speak up or why you feel alone in your struggles, this conversation today is for you. We're sitting down with a psychologist who knows exactly what men are going through. And it's not just another podcast. I think it's a lifeline for many men who struggle to talk about their mental health. We're chatting to Dr. Eli Joubert. He's a clinical psychologist and a sexologist who is currently living and working in the UK. He has several specialist areas, but today we are talking to him specifically about how men manage their mental health needs. I'm going to link another conversation I had with him at the end of this chat, and you'll find it interesting because that dealt with monogamy. So let's hear his thoughts on men's mental health. Dr. Eli, if men struggle with their mental health, and we often hear it's very difficult for them to open up, is it harder or easier if you, as a male psychologist, have them as a client?
I think it depends very much on the man. I think for many men, if they have to see a female therapist or a female psychologist, they might feel that they have to maintain all the constructs around their masculinity that support their masculinity. So then for them to be more vulnerable with a woman might feel more difficult. For them to speak about that might feel more difficult. Um, Whereas with a male therapist, they might feel a lot more comfortable, to do that because there's a sort of a familiarity, a way in which a male therapist can understand that, right? So certainly that would be the case for some men. I would argue that's probably the case for most men, but we can't say that that is a general rule because we always have exceptions, and so some men might feel more comfortable speaking with a woman because they might have had difficult experiences with other men in the past. And so, therefore, with a woman, they might feel more comfortable. I think there's also something just about a therapeutic intervention, a therapeutic space, um, which is important to consider. If we think about therapy, we basically think of two people sitting in a room and talking. And there is a particular way in which the therapist would hold him or herself in that conversation, right? And I would argue that that space is just in its very nature is much more female friendly because women are used to sitting and having conversations and talking about things and talking about their lives, whereas men, there's something called instrumental intimacy. So men are more likely to go fishing and talk about whatever's happening when they fish or when they play golf or when they play computer games. So they have an activity that they do that somehow makes the intimacy of the talking less
Mm.
overwhelming, less uncomfortable. And when you have a male therapist who's aware of that, then even though you still have just two men in a room sitting and talking, there is a slight different awareness of that space and a slightly different way of being with that, And so the therapist might be a bit more playful in therapy, than they might otherwise be, that might make it easier for the man. Yeah, so it depends. There's lots of factors, but I think for me the important bit here is that we must have an option. That if a man chooses to see a male therapist, he must have that option available to him, and not only have the option of seeing a female therapist.
Has the perception of men having to be vulnerable in therapy have we seen a shift, or do men still need to be persuaded to go to see a therapist when they have mental health issues?
When we talk about men, we have to consider that men aren't sort of a homogenous group. Not all men are the same, and not all men would
Mm.
have the same preferences, right? So I think in most Western countries, or even English-speaking countries, what we have seen is an encouragement for men to be more comfortable and open about their mental health. It's more okay for a man to say that I have mental health difficulties. So in that sense, yes, there's sort of an ease with that more so than it was perhaps for when I was in my 20s or 30s. So
Mm.
certainly I think there's that shift. But then we would have men that are perhaps more liberal with the idea of masculinity, more flexible with that, where then talking about mental health, expressing their mental health becomes easier. But then we have other men which are much more invested for various reasons. in a more traditional understanding of their masculinity, which of course is also culturally informed. And for them, that might be a lot more difficult than to be open about their mental health needs. We also have to just think that, for some men who are quite invested in the being part of, the norm of the day, so feeling drawn to whatever is positioned as important today, then in that instance, if mental health is made an important thing to talk about, they might even force themselves to talk about their mental health because that's what now expected of them, rather than because they have a need for that, so the invitation for men to be more open about their mental health is a great thing, and I certainly would encourage that. But we shouldn't then force men to do certain things that they feel uncomfortable with, or in spaces that they don't feel comfortable with.
And this perception of vulnerability, has it changed that we no longer look at it as a weakness? Do men have they shifted in their minds about I'm to unload, I have to bare my soul in therapy?
I think that's a very complex question, Lynette, because more traditionally, men are allowed only two feelings. Men are allowed to be happy and to be angry. And so when a man feels lonely, when he feels depressed, when he feels sad, when he feels vulnerable, when he feels concerned about work or whatever, he's more likely to be irritable and snappy, or to make fun of himself or the situation. And that's how he is allowed to express his feelings, than to actually, be open about what he's feeling and all of that. Right? So um, I think in that sense, it's not always easy for men to express their feelings. And it's also one thing, for the world to tell somebody it's okay to talk about your mental health, for a man even to accept that it's okay for me to have mental health needs, is one thing. It's a different thing to then have to seek out support and help and all of those things when certain constructs are still in place. When he's concerned, how might my best friend or my child's friend's father, perceive me if they know that I'm seeing a therapist? How might my boss perceive me? Might I lose my job? So it's not quite as simple as I'm okay with it, and therefore I can go and see a therapist. Because all of this, of course, also sits within society, and we have to remember masculinity is a very, very fragile construct, and it is a construct that is constantly policed. So a basic thing, if you have a man that is very liberal, very open-minded, and uses moisturizer, almost guaranteed it has to say "for men" on the packaging. Right. And that's how fragile masculinity would be. For younger men, particularly around sex, they are often, their masculinity is linked to their sexual performance. So then if they don't, for instance, if they feel anxious in a sexual situation and they have erectile dysfunction in that moment, it's not just that they have erectile dysfunction, their very essence of who they are as a man might be challenged in that moment. They police it. Society police it, because society tells us a man should be somebody that is always ready for sex. If they are heterosexual, their female partners would also police that. And so if he's not able to get an erection, that has meaning, and that meaning can be complex, it can be differently interpreted. So the point I'm making here, it's not as simple as for a man just to be comfortable with his mental health and therefore say, I'm going to seek help, when his masculinity is very much linked to that, and it's very much policed in all aspects of life.
We're still going to have a discussion in the future about erectile dysfunction, and invite men to participate and ask questions, even if they're uncomfortable, to create that kind of space to have that conversation. I just want to go back to two things that you mentioned, and I wanted to address the perception of it. That so often I hear men say, but also in conversation, that masculinity is under siege. Is it so, or has our perceptions of what we want masculinity to be, has that been challenged, and that's why men are having a difficulty identifying with what the expectations are and who they really are, or how they've evolved?
You ask very complex questions, Lynette, and that's another complex
Sorry.
question. So I'll answer it best as I can. I think that there is this general narrative about toxic masculinity, um, and we don't always understand what we mean by that. And if we start to unpack toxic masculinity, in summary, what it means, patriarchy favors men in many ways, right? But in order to have that privilege of masculinity, you have to perform in a particular way. You have to be a particular kind of man. So for my generation, if you were gay as a man, your masculinity becomes questioned. So just your sexual orientation, you need to perform a heterosexual orientation if you are not that, in order to have privilege to that. Then if you are perhaps somewhat less secure in your masculinity, you might um, reach out for the more extreme forms of masculinity. So, such as a man needs to be aggressive, and a man needs to be able to defend himself. If another man challenges you, you must sort of engage that, right? And those things in the extreme
Mm,
become the more toxic aspect of masculinity. But then what we do is anything that is perceived as male can very easily become toxified, if you like. So we might say to a man who might have um, a very appropriate way of expressing his anger in irritation in a very appropriate situation, that he's being hyper masculine, that he's being toxic, he's being aggressive, and all of those
mm,
things, right?
mm,
And
mm,
then at the same time, we celebrate that aggression when we expect that man to play a contact sport, and when he breaks his finger playing rugby, to just continue playing, because that's what a man does. A man deals with that, right? We expect that
mm,
same man to be happy to go and volunteer as a soldier and risk his life. When we have situations of conflict or yeah, some form of war, rebellion, we typically evacuate children and women first. We don't evacuate who's vulnerable and ask to remain those that are powerful, right? There are lots of women that are really powerful and very confident. And then there are men who are really fragile and vulnerable, right? But they are then forced in that situation. So the point I'm making here is the the hyper masculine, the more aggressive, the more toxic part of masculinity is not all of what masculinity is. But then what happens is the average man just hears my masculinity is problematic. For me to
mm,
be a guy is somehow problematic because I'm necessarily framed as being sexually inappropriate, as being aggressive, as being
mm,
opportunistic,
mm.
as being all of those things, right? And I'm not, but now I'm framed as such, right? So as a person, I am not seen. I'm just seen as a man, right? And that maleness is a very narrow frame of what is allowed for that. So I appreciate that men do feel that their masculinity is under siege, because masculinity can very easily be problematized, and they are only seen as this frame of man rather than as a person.
Yes.
That is not necessarily the case that all men are under siege as such, right? And I think the important bit here, and maybe that's part of what we can achieve here, is that we have to think in nuanced terms
Mm,
about masculinity, how we see men. How do we see men as individual people, not only as men? And how do we see that certain aspects of what we expect of a man in a certain instance? So, for instance, to be able to defend his child, right? How do we see that then in a different context as problematic? And does he have the skill? And have we provided him with the opportunity to shift into different contexts and behave differently?
that first meeting with a new client or a new patient, um, what is that like? Do you have to, or do you ask um, the man why he's come to see you? I'm just wondering what brings him to your doorstep. If we're talking about all these other struggles that a man has to deal
Sure,
with before he
sure,
even reaches out to you.
sure. Yes, of course. I mean, part of starting a therapeutic process is that one would do an assessment to understand what is the need of the man coming into therapy. Why is he seeking therapy in the first instance?
Mm,
Um, and that can be varied. And often it would be very similar things as a woman might be. I'm depressed. I'm anxious. But then when you start to scratch the surface, things start to look a little bit different often. So I've had men who've come to see me because they seemingly are depressed. Um, and when you start to understand that, they actually might feel quite disempowered at work. They might feel that they can't speak up, because if they do speak up, then there might be negative consequences. If their manager is a woman, they feel quite, how do I position myself in relation to this so that I am not perceived as the toxic man in this situation? And then they still have the pressure often that they have to provide for their families. They might not be the only
Mm.
income earner, but they are certainly one of the income earners. And again, if we go to constructs of masculinity, part of what being a man is being able to provide for your family. And so if that is lost, then your whole masculinity becomes questioned in that way. So initially things might look very similar, but when you start to scratch the surface, it looks a little bit different, right? What I'm also starting to see, and this is really problematic, are men who are going through divorce, and
Wow.
particularly when there are issues around custody, how the court system, at least in the UK, how the court system almost automatically favors the mother, right? And the mother might, in instances, the mother have been arrested for domestic violence, but then the court would still consider her to be the better parent, and
Hmm.
the legal costs and all of that is necessarily his cost more often than it would be hers, right? So for a father to have access to his children in a divorce thing can be a really big battle. And it doesn't matter how good he can present himself as a father, the court system will almost always favor the mother and have more empathy. She was violent in that situation because of all the pressure she feels as a mother, but if we wouldn't flip that he was perhaps a bit
Mm.
more aggressive in a domestic situation because of all the pressure he feels, he's just bad, whereas we understand her. So then men have a lot of difficulty and feelings of guilt about, how are my children going to think of me as a father, because in their opinion, I have left. The mother might, in her own toxic way, frame me as negative, frame me as problematic. How do I maintain that? And what does that mean for me as a man? Right?
I hear you. I was about to sneeze there for a moment and I thought, oh, I mustn't sneeze on such a crucial point that you are making. I'm wondering if you look at where men find themselves, because a lot of this and what you've raised has to do with perceptions and whether we are in a position where we are able to confront ourselves and our own perceptions of masculinity or relationships, as you pointed out, that the courts tend to favor women. I want to get back to, yes, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, absolutely. I think that it is about perception, but it's not only about perception of masculinity, it's also about perception of
Mm.
femininity. It's about how we frame both genders and how we position goodness in certain frames to some genders and badness to other genders. A basic thing. If we in the UK, 83% of all psychologists who work in the healthcare system are women. And in South Africa and America,
Wow.
it's roughly the same. It's about 80% of psychologists are women, right? Now, if we made that differently, if we said 80% of all psychologists are men, we wouldn't be comfortable with that. And we would have all sorts of initiatives and programs, and even perhaps forced things that we do for university selection processes, so that we can have more parity around all of this,
Mm,
right?
mm.
But when it comes, and in the UK, 2 or 3 months ago, there was a big celebration in the newspapers, because for the first time, the General Medical Council, which is the body where all doctors have to register, have more women registered. So there are more female doctors in the UK than there are men. That was celebrated, as it should be, right? Because something successful have happened where we have now much more of a parity around that. But when it
Mm.
comes to psychology, nursing, all the caring professions in a mental health way, men are very much underrepresented, and we don't do anything about it. We don't name it. We don't speak about it. At times when I have spoken about that at conferences, I've been told you're a very brave man to raise that, right? And why should I be a brave man to point
Yes.
out the fact that we are not actually providing men opportunities to do that? So we also then frame that mental
Mm,
health is a woman's thing, it's not a man's thing, right? And we make
mm,
assumptions. We make assumptions that women would prefer to see female therapists, particularly if a woman has a history of trauma, particularly sexual trauma, that she would want to
yes.
see a female therapist, which is, I can guarantee you from my clinical work, is not the case. Many women actually prefer to see a male therapist, but then we would at least allow the woman the option of, would you want to see a male or a female therapist, right? If she says, I want to have a male therapist, most likely they won't be one to offer her that, right? And then we've never even asked men those questions. Would you prefer a male or a female therapist? And typically, if you work in a health system, um, they won't be the male therapist to provide him if he chooses to have a male therapist.
Mm,
We
mm.
don't do anything about that. We
Um,
don't talk
um,
about it. We don't acknowledge that. Nothing.
I'm thinking as you're explaining the not only the perceptions but the assumptions that even if a man naturally feels drawn to certain services where you either want to be as a carer, for example, then the assumption is made, oh, one's either he's very in touch with his feminine side, we'll hear stuff like that, comments like that, or he must be gay, or he's,
Exactly.
or he probably took care of his grandmother, and now that's his
Yes.
perception of what caring or
Yes.
the caring sector entails.
Exactly, because for a man to be caring, of course, he can't be a man and be caring. He has to be in touch with his feminine side to be caring, because men aren't caring. That's how we frame it, right? Um, and there is a very
Mm,
masculine way of caring. If we look at how fathers can be very good with their children in a very masculine way, be caring, right? So a man doesn't have to be in touch with his feminine side to be caring and nurturing. There's a very male thing. And if we have
mm,
men who want to become mental health nurses, become psychologists, become social workers, they might not allow that to themselves because that's a woman's job, right? And the infrastructure around it supports that idea that it's a woman's
mm,
job, right?
mm,
There's a bit of a saying which is actually used in uh, promoting women into professions that were typically male, is, if I can't see it, I can't be it, right? So if a woman sees somebody that is a prime minister, then she can in
I
herself
get
imagine, I can be a prime minister.
representation. Yes,
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 right. But
yes.
if there are very few men who are
Mm,
psychologists, and those men are, as you say, framed as being very effeminate or very in touch with their feminine side or gay, right? Then how can the average straight man or masculine man, or gay man for that matter, think I can
mm.
enter into those professions without losing or questioning my masculinity?
How you touched on it briefly, but I want us to, for a moment, just sit with this. How does fatherhood, whether it's good or bad, how does that influence the mental health of the male child or men as they grow up?
Parenting is a complex thing, I would say, and
Mm,
it's both the mother and the father that has a role in that. But certainly in the same way that a girl will emulate her mother and would take certain characteristics or behaviors from her mother, the man would do the same, or the boy would do the same, right? And so, I mean, it's a very complex psychological process. But if the father isn't available, then he might project into the idea of a father rather than an actual father, and he might then be more vulnerable to the more stereotypical idea of what a man is, because his idea is not an experience of a man, but the idea of a man, which might be aggressive, which might be all sorts of
mm,
things, right? Because that's how it's framed. So the to have access to a man, whether it is his actual father or an uncle or a grandfather or even just a mum's best male friend, is, I would argue, a really important aspect of creating healthy masculinities. And there are programs both in the UK and South Africa that I know of, which mentors men, young men into a healthy masculinity, and particularly men where father might be absent. Right.
Mm.
So
That
yes, it is really important, the father role in his growing up and understanding himself as a man.
That's why I raised that question, because absent fathers in South Africa is such a huge problem and
Mm.
has such detrimental effect on what we see with men, not just struggling with their mental health, but that there is no role modeling. And you find so often that the fact that there's an absent father is attributed to a lot of the psychological, but also the emotional problems that we have in households, because often it's the mothers who have to raise the boys.
And I agree with that. I think it is highly problematic that we have absent fathers, but we then have to think about and understand, why do we have absent fathers, right? And
Mm,
it's very easy to then think of them as just absent. They're not interested. They somehow, these dads are bad, right? Whatever we mean by bad, but that's the reason. When we start to scratch the surface, it might actually look very different. That what often happens is, when a mother has a child, her attention is focused only on the baby. And if we then have a father who does not feel included, a father who might not have had a strong relationship with the mother to start with, um, all of those factors might make it difficult for him to stay. That's not to say that's okay for him to leave, but it is not as simple as to say he's just bad or not interested, or he's just an absent father. It's a much more complex thing. In the same way, when we think about violence towards women, we can't just say that these are bad men who are violent towards women. We have to understand how we as a society contribute to creating those violent behaviors in men. In the same way, how do we as a society contribute to having absent fathers? What is it that we do?
mm,
And not just position that as a male problem, or even
mm,
within certain cultural aspects, that it is a male problem within that culture. It is a much more complex thing. Um, but again, I would argue, and perhaps some would disagree with me, we find it difficult to think about and hold in mind that a man who behaves in a way that is not ideal is not just bad. That we don't
mm.
just problematize it, but we actually think about it. We try to understand it and have empathy, etc., etc. Yeah.
Just like women, men aren't just one dimensional.
Completely, yes. But as I say, men have a much more narrow experience. There are some. There's one particular psychologist, an American psychologist, who says it's not possible for a man to be a man and a human being at the same time, because in order to be a man, you have to let go so much of your humanness to retain your masculinity. And I completely agree with that. And of course, that's not true for all men, but there certainly
Yes.
is, from a more traditional aspect around masculinity, there can be those expectations that might not allow him certain aspects of his humanity.
In your experience, what are some of the biggest lies that men tell themselves about their mental health?
I'm okay. I can deal with this. A real man will be able to deal with this on his own, right? Those, I mean, you can phrase it in different ways, but that's basically it. Is I can deal with this. It's not such a big deal. I will be okay. Yeah. And then second to that is, for me to seek help is weak, is not particularly masculine. I will lose a sense of respect for myself. Others won't like me. Something to that effect around weakness, if I seek out help and support, because that's not what a man does. We socialize men to fix problems, right? Women would often say, "I just want him to listen to me and not give me an answer to how to fix the problem," right? He tells you how to fix the problem because that's how he's socialized, right? And so for himself as well, is I feel depressed. I must fix this problem. And how do I fix this problem? Right? It's not how do I ask for help and support? How do I understand what is happening? How do I perhaps accept that I don't know how to fix this problem, and that I need to have support and guidance with this?
Mm. When we hear about men who chose to unalive themselves, we often say, but what brought him to that point? Whether he ends his own life or that of his family members, we seem to struggle to understand, but often after the fact. Take us through that conversation and whether that's changed or not.
Another complex question. I
I'm
think
so
that no, it's fine.
I
Yeah,
know it's not simplified. I do get that. I just want to use the opportunity, let request
sure,
myself.
sure.
I just want to use the opportunity because you know what? There are so few spaces that I've seen and I've heard over the years that allows men to just talk to men. And the support groups are few and far between that you have to really go seek them out because
Yes,
there aren't enough spaces and platforms created. And I would
yes.
just like us to open up, as complex as it is. As you said
Yeah,
earlier,
yeah,
not all men are the same. So
yeah.
it's more for that kind of
Sure,
almost like a
sure.
passage to
Yeah, yeah.
to to have that conversation.
Well, what we do know, our statistics tell us that men are much more likely, as it's put in England, to complete suicide, that they would die at their own hands compared to women. And there are significant differences in that. And the reasons for that, when we start to think about it, are a combination of factors. It would be men who are in distress, and who don't know how to manage that distress, who don't know how to ask for help, who might feel very, very vulnerable in asking for help. And it might seem like an easier option to not ask for
Mm,
help, but just to end things. Right? Um, there are the other contributing factor to that is, men are, depending who you ask, some might say biologically, other would say psychologically driven to be a bit more aggressive. And we as a society need men often to be aggressive. We don't want soldiers and police officers who can't be
mm,
hold the fort, so to speak, right? So we are also invested in that aggression of men to some extent. But then when men become distressed, and as I said earlier, men are only allowed two feelings, one of them being anger, and the expression of
yes.
anger can be aggression, right? So then it's self-directed. I'm the failure. I don't know how to deal with this, and so then it's best just to kill myself in that moment, right?
Mm,
So I don't think it would be helpful for us to try and simplify that, because it's a very, very complex thing. But what we have to accept is that men are much more likely to do that than women would be. There are complex factors
mm,
that contribute to that, which are very clearly linked to constructs of
mm,
masculinity. And we have to understand, again, how do we as a society contribute to and maintain those constructs of masculinity that might, in the end, be detrimental? A basic thing: we don't
mm,
provide men with male therapists if they choose to have that, because we don't see it as a valuable thing. We don't talk about the fact that men are underrepresented. So, therefore, we frame caring as a woman's thing. Um, and in so many ways, just that already impacts negatively on men and their ability to deal with their mental health. And then what we see is those men who don't um, kill themselves, who don't unalive themselves, are more likely to then go and do things like drink too much or become
yes.
self-abusive in other ways, right? Um, because that's allowed. A man can drink, a man can hold his drink. So for a man that is depressed or worried about losing his job, for him to get drunk, that's the right thing to do, right? That's how we
Mm,
frame it as a society, and we don't
mm.
understand why is he getting drunk. We just think of him as being this sort of problematic man that drinks too much. Of course, I'm making
It's
gross
to
generalizations. There are lots of people
I
who
know I hear
do
you.
think about men. Yeah,
Of
yeah,
course, of
yeah.
course, of course. And we're just looking at various scenarios. I'm want to place myself in the shoes of a man that comes to you, one of your patients or one of your clients. What's the conversation that he has with his wife? And how does the wife or the partner, let's not assume also, How do you support your partner who feels, I do need help, I need to see a therapist or a
Sure.
psychologist? How do you be that anchor, or hold or create space in that marriage or in that partnership for your male partner?
So I think for heterosexual men, by the time that they come to see me, they have been around the block a few times. They've tried all sorts of ways of addressing their problems. And they might come to see me because their wives or girlfriends have insisted that they come to see me. Sometimes it happens that at work they have been told that they need to see a therapist. So it's not their choice; they are instructed to do that. Sometimes wives, girlfriends might say, "If you don't, then I'm not sure I can stay with you." So there is a real consequence to you not doing that, right? And so
Mm.
then men would comply to that, usually quite reluctantly, but nonetheless they would do that. The flip of that is that I have seen men where their wives and girlfriends don't know that they are seeking help, that nobody knows that they're seeking help, and then they can do that somewhat anonymously, and that already is quite difficult for them just to enter into the space, right? And they would have thought about it often for months, even years, and have tried and not, and tried and not, so it is much more difficult for gay men. I think because it's more okay to talk about feelings and things, because gay masculinity, by its very nature, is a much more considered masculinity, because so often, uh, as I said earlier, being gay and being male can't be aligned. And so younger gay men have to think about their own masculinity, deal with all of that. So they are much more okay to deal and think about their own internal world, and be more flexible about their masculinity. And so then for them to seek out support is an easier route than for a heterosexual man who's framed quite differently around that. And for those men, the partner usually would know, or it's not a thing. It's not something that I need to discuss with my partner. If I told him I'm in therapy, it's fine. It wouldn't be a problem, right? My experience would be that I've seen men who have had, as I said earlier, really tricky relationships with their wives, where the wives have
Mm.
been physically abusive, where the wives have threatened to take their children away, and that sometimes happened. And so then for them to share what happens in therapy becomes much more problematic. They might initially come into therapy because she's forced them to, because he's the problem, not the couple, or she's the problem, he's the problem, and he needs fixing. And I sometimes would get indirect messages that my wife said I must talk to you about this, right? So she's even present in therapy, dictating what must happen in therapy, right? And then that conversation with what happens with the wife or the girlfriend is very different to a supportive wife or girlfriend, or as I
Mm.
said earlier, a wife or girlfriend who's not even aware.
Mm. There are two other questions that three. I wanted us, and I know you mentioned it in the beginning of our conversation, but I do feel we need to elaborate on that, particularly when we talk about support groups. You said men have instrumental intimacy, and you gave some examples. Are we then saying that no other time, unless for that purpose of either having a barbecue, a braai, or watching sport, and there's a moment that they won't otherwise connect and seek out other men in that growth process, in that I need to connect with another male
Mm.
energy or what to help me carry this load.
No, I don't say that. I think there are very specific spaces that are very specifically framed as therapeutic spaces for men. And certainly, I would say that there aren't enough of those. There need to be more of that.
Mm.
And we need to, as a society, promote that more. But what happens in those spaces might, in some ways, draw on this concept of instrumental intimacy. So it might not just be that it's a group of men sitting in a circle. It might be that there's a certain activity that happens. Even if what happens is that there is a fire in the middle of the circle, right? And we are all invested in keeping the fire going. So the the male therapeutic space, the support groups and all of that could be very typical to what you might think a support group could be, but it could also be very different. And typically those that I would argue would draw um, a man that might feel more uncomfortable with a typical idea involves some form of activity, involves some form of, I become close to you not because I've shared with you in terms of talking, but because we've walked up the mountain together, or because we've gone, I don't know, meditated together, or build a fire
Yeah.
together, or whatever it might be, Yeah.
So after our discussion the long time, and I'm going to link that conversation we had about monogamy. I had a conversation with men, a few men, and I asked them. So based on what you said and your statements and so forth, your views, I asked if you in a bromance, if a man confessed or shared with another man that he was having an affair, he was cheating, would that man address it? And how would he address it? And there was a lot of uncomfortable men who said, we just don't go there. We just don't go there. It's not our business, you know? Um, is that some, are those the silent rules, the unspoken rules in bromances, in male friendships that, this is where we draw the line?
Yes and no. We get different sorts of male
Of
friendships.
course.
We can have men who, I don't know, play cricket together or go fishing together. All of these things where there's a real familiarity, there's a real investment, but it is about the thing we do together. That's how we link, and the things that we talk about it. Work and about maybe a bit about money. We might talk about, the wife is irritating me or whatever. Of course, this is in the heterosexual context.
Yes.
Those, but it's a relatively superficial level, but nonetheless a really important aspect of male bonding. Because, as I say, it's not in the sharing of the mind; it is in the being together that the connection happens, right? And so then, what happens in sex and sex lives might not always be important. Although we might say that for younger men, particularly because for younger heterosexual men, their masculinity is often linked to their sexual performance. So they might then, in a very celebratory way, almost talk about their sexual conquests and things, because it reinforces their masculinity and it gives them a particular position in the social order of their friends, of how they fit within in their friends. So in that sense, they might talk about it. But then when there are real close sort of male connections, real close friendships, to then talk about I've been unfaithful, I've had a sexual experience other than with my partner, becomes more possible when they understand that
Okay.
their male friend can hear them. Um, you know, um, yeah, I think it's again different things for different men. I would argue that younger men probably would be more playful around that, and when they hear it from a friend as well, would be more engaged in a playful manner about that. Yeah.
What do you wish every man that entered your office or your sessions, your therapy sessions, what would you like them to know about their mental health, about therapy, to challenge themselves, but also to allow them the freedom to just sit down and create that space with you?
The essence of that is that your masculinity is not necessarily threatened by seeking help. It is okay to ask for help. If I'm being a little bit blunt here, there's a bit of a saying that it takes balls to be vulnerable, right? So the real masculine thing is actually the thing that requires strength and commitment, which is a male thing, is to say, I need help. And so it is entirely possible for a man to not only retain his masculinity, but actually become a better man by seeking help and support in therapy. But it is important for him to be clear about what is it that he wants and who does he want it from. And then, of course, he's going to feel anxious. Of course, it's going to be an awkward situation for him, but not to let that um, stop him from doing that. And also to not have a preconceived idea that therapy is what you see, sort of a Hollywood version of what a therapist is and what happens in therapy. There's a whole wide range of what it could be. And the last bit is there are actually many resources for men around their mental health and how to address their mental health, and to look at that and to find what works for you, and then to seek that out, and to not expect that because something works for someone else, be they male or female, that it must work for me. That it's okay to seek out what you want.
And if there are men or women listening to this conversation who want to seek out a further deeper conversation with you, where do they reach you? How do they reach you? Do you have a website that you can reference for them to
Yes.
go and check you out?
Check me out. Yes, I do have a website, which is basically my name, and it is heliyubar.co.uk. There's information about that. As you mentioned at the start, I have many different hats. I'm a psychologist. I'm also a sexologist. I'm also a gender specialist, and so you can read about all of that on my website. Yeah.
All right. So it's
Eli,
Eli,
and
Eli,
then my surname
yes,
Yubar.co.uk.
JOUBERT.co.uk. All right.
Correct.